Imagine standing alone in the darkness. The year is 1943. The Eastern Front has become one of the deadliest battlefields in human history. The night is silent. Cold wind moves across the trees. German soldiers sit in their trenches trying to rest after another exhausting day of war. Then a strange sound appears above them. A soft whisper, barely noticeable at first. Not the roar of an engine, not the scream of a fighter aircraft. Just a faint rushing sound moving through the darkness. The soldiers look up. They see nothing, only black skis. Then suddenly, explosions tear through the night. Bombs fall from above. The earth shakes beneath their feet. Men dive for cover. Panic spreads through the camp. And before anyone can react, the aircraft are gone. Vanished into the darkness. Again, and again, and again. German soldiers would eventually give these mysterious pilots a name they would never forget. They called them the Night Witches. This is the story of the young Soviet women who flew fragile wooden aircraft into one of the most brutal wars in human history and became legends. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion ever attempted. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Thousands of tanks rolled forward, thousands of aircraft filled the skies. Entire Soviet armies were overwhelmed, cities fell, villages burned, millions of civilians fled eastward. Within weeks, the Soviet Union faced a catastrophe unlike anything it had ever seen. The country desperately needed soldiers, but it also needed pilots. And pilots were not easy to replace. Every aircraft required skilled crews. Every mission required trained aviators. Losses were mounting at a rate that left commanders struggling for solutions. The Soviet military needed help, and thousands of women were ready to answer the call. The person who made it possible had a name that every Soviet citizen already knew. Marina Raskova was the most famous female aviator in the country. In 1938, she had become the first woman to serve as a navigator on a long-distance Soviet record flight, a journey that ended with her parachuting alone into the Siberian wilderness and surviving for 10 days before rescue teams found her. The Soviet Union celebrated her as a national hero. Crowds gathered when she returned. Children grew up wanting to fly like Marina Raskova. She received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the highest honor the country could give. But when the war came, Raskova saw something beyond the medals and the celebrations. She saw thousands of trained women pilots who were being turned away by a military that did not believe women belonged in combat. She refused to accept it. Using her fame and her personal connections, she wrote directly to Joseph Stalin. She argued that the Soviet Union was losing pilots faster than it could train them. She argued that thousands of qualified women were sitting idle. She argued that a nation fighting for its survival could not afford to waste any resource. Stalin listened. In October 1941, with German forces pressing toward Moscow, he authorized the creation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. Marina Raskova would command them. It was a decision that would change the war. The volunteers arrived from every corner of the Soviet Union. They were students and teachers, factory workers and athletes, women who had learned to fly at civilian aero clubs across the country, women who had followed Raskova's record flights in the newspapers and decided that they too wanted to go further than anyone expected them to go. Some were barely 18 years old. They arrived at the Angels Military Aviation School on the Volga River with almost nothing, civilian clothes, small bags, a willingness to do whatever the war required. The training was immediate and unrelenting. What normally took several years was compressed into months. They studied navigation, meteorology, aircraft mechanics, bombing techniques. They slept in shifts. They ate quickly. They studied until their eyes gave out, and then they studied again. But there was something else happening inside those cold barracks and training fields that no curriculum could capture. These young women were building something together. They were becoming a unit. They were learning to trust each other with their lives. And they were quietly, methodically preparing to prove every person wrong who had ever told them that war was not their place. The aircraft they were assigned did not inspire immediate confidence. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a small, slow, open cockpit biplane, originally designed for crop dusting and basic flight training. It had a maximum speed slower than many of the aircraft it would face. It was made of wood and canvas. It carried no armor, no radar, no radio in many cases. It could not outrun a German fighter. It could not outgun one. It could not absorb damage the way heavier military aircraft could. By the standards of modern aerial warfare, it should not have been anywhere near a battlefield. But it had qualities that no one fully appreciated until the women began flying it at night. It was nearly silent at low speed. It could fly so low that radar could not detect it. It could land in almost any flat field, which meant it could operate from forward positions that larger aircraft could never reach. And it was light enough to be maintained and repaired by the pilots themselves, with whatever parts were available. The women of the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment learned to see their aircraft not as a limitation, but as a tool, and they rebuilt everything around what it could do. Night bombing was not simply bombing in darkness. It required a completely different way of thinking about combat. There were no sophisticated targeting systems, no electronic navigation aids. A pilot and her navigator flew together in an open cockpit, exposed to temperatures that fell far below freezing at altitude, using maps, compasses, and the landscape below them to find their targets. A single small fire on the ground could mean a road. A silver ribbon of reflected moonlight could mean a river. A cluster of faint lights could mean a supply depot that needed to be destroyed. The women memorized terrain. They learned to read the ground from the air in conditions of near-total darkness. They also learned to fly without being heard. On approach to a target, the pilot would cut the engine entirely. The aircraft would become a glider, descending in near silence toward the German position below. German soldiers listening in the dark would hear nothing until the bombs were already falling. By then, the pilot had restarted the engine and was climbing away into the night. It was the sound of that silent glide, the soft rush of wind through wooden struts and canvas wings, that the Germans heard before the explosions. They said it sounded like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the sky. The name spread through the German lines. Nachtwechseln, night witches. The fear that name carried was not accidental. It was earned. The 588th Regiment typically flew between 8 and 15 missions in a single night. To carry more bombs than the small aircraft could manage in one trip, crews would land, reload, and take off again, sometimes within minutes. In the summer months, when darkness lasted only a few hours, the pressure was constant. Each crew flew until the sky began to lighten, then landed to rest, and prepared to go out again the following night. The missions were not safe. The aircraft had no parachutes in the early months of the war. There was no weight to spare. If a plane was hit and caught fire, the crew had no way out. German fighter pilots who shot down a Night Witch received the Iron Cross. That fact alone communicated how seriously the Germans took these women, and how dangerous it had become to be one of them. The risks were understood by everyone who flew. They flew anyway. 30 women from the regiment never came home. They died in burning aircraft. They died in crashes caused by engine failure or enemy fire. They died navigating through storms that would have grounded larger, better-equipped units. Their names were read aloud before missions. The women who remained flew harder. There is a quality that emerges in certain human beings when they have lost people they love to a cause they believe in. It is not recklessness. It is not despair. It is something quieter and more durable, a kind of settled determination that has moved beyond the question of fear entirely. The Night Witches had that quality. Pilots like Najda Popova, who flew 852 combat missions and would later say that she had never once thought about stopping. Pilots like Irina Sebrova, who would complete more than 1,000 sorties before the war was over, a number almost incomprehensible even within a unit that was itself extraordinary. These women did not emerge from the war unchanged. But they did not stop. By 1943, The unit's impact was being measured in more than individual courage. Sustained night bombing of German supply lines, communication posts and troop positions forced the enemy to post additional anti-aircraft defenses, specifically to deal with aircraft that were nearly impossible to detect. Resources that could have gone elsewhere were redirected toward a problem that refused to go away. The regiment struck targets along the Caucasus, in Crimea, and during the long, grinding Soviet advance that eventually pushed German forces westward across territory they had once captured so quickly. In January 1943, the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment was renamed the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, the Guards designation being one of the highest honors the Soviet military could bestow on a combat unit. They had proved everything they needed to prove. And still they flew. When the war finally ended in 1945, 23 members of the regiment had been awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union. The regiment had flown more than 23,000 combat sorties. They had done it in wooden biplanes that most military planners would never have considered for combat use. They had done it in the dark. They had done it at an age when many of them should have been finishing their university studies or beginning careers that the war had interrupted. Marina Raskova did not live to see the victory. She died in January 1943 during a navigation error in poor weather conditions while ferrying a bomber to the front. She was 30 years old. The Soviet Union gave her a state funeral. Her ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall. But her idea, her absolute insistence that these women belonged in the sky, outlived her entirely. History sometimes focuses on what was most visible in a war, the great battles, the famous names, the decisive moments that everyone agrees mattered. What is harder to see and harder to measure is what persistence looks like, night after night in conditions where failure means death, where the aircraft itself is barely adequate, where every qualification and credential has been earned twice over simply because no one expected the work to be done at all. The Night Witches were never fully celebrated in the post-war years. They were not invited to participate in many of the major victory parades. Some of their stories went untold for decades. But the record of what they did exists. 23,000 sorties, 30 dead, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, a German army that gave them a name rooted in fear, because no name based on contempt would have been accurate. They were young women flying agging biplanes into the most violent war the world had ever produced. They were not expected to change anything. They changed everything. The Night Witches flew into darkness, and the darkness was never the same again. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel.